right. If we could get another chair, I will give you this one for now. Nothing but flexible, right? There we go. Sorry about that, Colin.
No problem.
Apparently we can't count, but that's another issue. What we're going to do this afternoon for this first session is we're going to start off. Ewan McLeod is going to give us a presentation on sort of the state of play and some of the dramatic changes in terms of these issues. Really looking forward to it. He's going to give us an overview from his experience at UNHCR. Just to tell you quickly about that, in addition to having field experience and being rooted in the field, I should say. It'd be good if I gave you the right introduction, wouldn't it? He's working as the head of policy, development, and evaluation of that service at UNHCR. He's had developmental, humanitarian roles, and a long career in Asia, Middle East, and Africa, as one does in UNHCR. Ewan will be giving us the first address. After that, I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel. But I think we're going to have a presentation. We'll have some discussion. Each one of our panelists, after I introduce them, moderated by Mr. Joe Saba, we'll have a discussion, some Q&A. Sir, would you kick us off?
Make sure they put the PowerPoint up.
Right, and if you start talking, I can come up with that.
Sure.
Just say next.
First of all, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to make a few remarks on this subject. I always think it's a bit of a disadvantage to go after lunch, so I hope what I say won't give you indigestion. I have to say I feel something of a little presumptuous to be addressing a group on agriculture and food, given that my only pretensions of knowledge in that area are the fact that my father was a farmer, but my own career has taken me in very, very different directions. But let me again say how pleased I am to offer a few, I hope, pertinent remarks. And so very quickly, asked to speak on what have been the changes over the last 5 years in particular. Actually, I thought I'd start a little bit further back and go to really the end of the Cold War in the early 90s and what the consequences have been for the global order, and particularly as they relate to conflict, violence, and fragility. Notions that we all thought we'd overcome at the end when the Berlin Wall fell, and widely proclaimed that liberal democracy was going to be the way forward. And what we've seen, I think, over the last 20, 30 years is something of an erosion of the credibility of that particular philosophy, and a realization that despite the huge advances that you all know better than I in economic and social indicators, there are still no given that development is a foreseeable linear progression. And the work that UNHCR does is testimony to that, and the figures that many of you in this room will be familiar with, we often give out this total of 65 million people, which of course globally is not a huge number of the entire planet's population. But I think what it does speak to are these trends in fragility, conflict, and violence that are of a particular menace to the developing world. We're all familiar of how difficult it has become to end conflicts. And a major reason for that is the rise of non-state armed groups, the most notorious of which in recent memory is, of course, ISIS. But there are many, many others around the world. And what their emergence has, amongst many other things, been a threat to is the traditional way of negotiating through diplomatic channels an end to conflict. And this is in part also linked to a phenomenon that really has only entered our public discourse in the last 10 or 15 years, that of fragile and failed states. And what are the components of those failed and fragile states that are such a threat to development in general, and particularly to agriculture and food security in particular? Well, we could perhaps name, I would say, 5 key components. First of all, most obviously, that governments, state authorities lack legitimacy with their populations. They fail to provide services, they fail to provide improved living standards. Linked to that is a chronic weakness in the public sector, an inability to deliver services, to set policies, and put in place the institutional arrangements to encourage growth and reduce poverty. Thirdly, very evidently, the first duty of a state is to provide security for its citizens. And when an authority fails to do that, it instantly lacks legitimacy. Insecurity often sets in and is probably the single most disruptive element in eroding the progress of such states. Their economies are generally quite small, markets are quite small, and for investors in the private sector to operate, it's high risk. That's also true of farmers. If you think that your land could be expropriated at any moment, your tendency is to avoid high-value crops which may take a time to realize profits and represent a high risk to your own livelihood system. And the markets generally are quite small and built around subsistence. And evidently, for the private sector to grow and or to address these big risks, they have to be addressing a more resilient population. So that combination of high risks and low resilience is often a feature of fragile and conflict-affected states. What are the consequences? A figure has been circulating recently of about $1.5 trillion, the cost of conflict around the world in 2014. If we think of Syria, perhaps a country that has come much in the headlines, a country that in the Arab world and Middle East was the most prominent to achieve the Millennium Development Indicators, but has now fallen so dramatically behind that in theory it might be eligible for IDA allocations in future. If I'm not mistaken, the figures, and Joe perhaps would know better than I, GDP in Syria estimated around 72 billion in 2011 has now fallen to under 30. We all are familiar with the dramatic pictures and the consequences of that. And I think, amongst other things, it was the Syrian conflict that has really brought my organization and the bank together in a common reflection on how we can possibly work productively to overcome some of the key challenges that the forced displacement agenda has thrown up. And we published together, and particularly pay tribute to the forced displacement team in the directorate in the bank that deals with fragility, conflict and violence, for the publication on forced displacement. This has helped us enormously to raise the profile, particularly of an issue that has always been dear to UNHCR's heart, which is encouraging a more developmental approach to forced displacement, conflict and fragility. As long ago as 1963, one of our former High Commissioners, Sadruddin Aga Khan, said, "We will not be able to find solutions to refugees until we see the engagement of economic and social development." So only looking at the problematic of refugees through the lens, as so many states tend to do, European states included, by the way, of only being a security and a political issue and not a developmental, economic and social issue, leads inevitably into misaligned policies and improper and ineffective institutional arrangements. Typically, what occurs in a forced displacement situation may be roughly akin to a seismic event. It's highly disruptive, a huge impact and injury occurs, but unlike a seismic event, its consequences on the human population go on for often, in the case of refugees, many decades. Very often, the image of refugees all in long lines of tents confined to camps, which is the predominant paradigm, is very misleading. Today, some 60% of refugees around the world are in urban situations, even if many of them may originally have come from rural backgrounds. How do they manage, therefore, in exile? And again, we can point to the primacy of policies and institutional arrangements. If you think of a country like Uganda, currently facing a huge refugee crisis from South Sudan, it has made remarkable steps in inclusive policies, allocating land to refugees, and I dare say some of Dorta's photographs that you may have seen speak to the wisdom of that policy. And yet, it's highly challenging for a state to accommodate such a huge number of people, and for the people themselves to accommodate themselves to a new context and a new environment, unfamiliar, disrupted from their normal livelihood systems and practices. I can think of other situations currently on our agenda, most notably Nigeria, where the Boko Haram displacement has had huge effects on agricultural production around the region, not only in northern Nigeria, but in the neighboring states. A country like Chad, where I visited briefly in November, the impact on the livestock trade has been huge. It's the second biggest component of the Chad economy. Maiduguri being the center of the regional livestock trade, the disruption has been massive, not only for Chad, but for Niger, and in particular for the transhumance corridors that spread from Central African Republic across northern Cameroon into Nigeria. So the effects of fragile conflict and violence affected states are not only within a sub-region of a country, but can spread dramatically across a region with enormous consequences. We also address challenges of solutions, and unhappily in recent years, our ability to return people to the country from which they came has diminished. I think many in this room may be familiar with how long, unfortunately, refugee situations can be prolonged. When eventually solutions do appear, very often in the form of political settlements, two things happen. Sadly, I think more than 50% lapse back into conflict within a relatively short space of time. And secondly, there are huge challenges related to the recovery of land in particular, and in states where land tenure and land administration has always been weak, the ability of families to recover their land and recover their former system is deeply challenged. And of course, the distortions of war economy. We've seen, for example, how opium has come to dominate the agriculture of Afghanistan. Let me then just quickly walk you through some of the slides that we prepared. I've got my eye on the time, so I'm not going to belabor these points. The first thing I'd like to underline is this is a phenomenon that affects the developing world. We have, in the last year or so, since the dramatic movements of Syrians and others into Europe, rather forgotten that refugees are predominantly found in developing countries. 86% is the figure that we normally give. And as with the increasing realization that poverty is rooted and found in the most fragile and violence-affected states of the world, this is where we have a significant portion of refugee populations. If you think of Somalia, Afghanistan, Yemen, the Central African Republic, these are very much at the epicenter of our concerns, but they're also at the center of poverty and the most extreme examples of fragility around the world. Our strategy, as far as possible, is to try and address the most extreme requirements that occur in the immediate aftermath of displacement. And that is typically when donor states react most generously and most predictably. The problem occurs thereafter, beyond the emergency phase, when we are very often left in quite remote regions of the developing world, providing the service provision that the state is unable and, unfortunately, in some instances, unwilling to provide, and resulting in situations where refugees become aid dependent. And as much as possible, the strategy is to extract people from dependence, particularly on food aid. And I've seen situations recently in Cameroon, which is not the poorest country, and where there is a large expanse of uncultivated and available land, refugee situations where food aid is continuing to be provided. There are other circumstances, notably in eastern Chad, where the opportunities to access land are much, much less, and where there is a genuine need to continue some sort of support. I'm not going to walk you through all the details of these figures. I'm very happy if the presentation is distributed afterwards. Just to highlight again the fact that most of these situations are in the developing world. They're very often in remote regions of states and countries where the reach of government and the reach of service provision in whatever sector is very limited. And often in the humanitarian world, we're accused of running parallel systems. And I feel that this is often a misconception, because in so many parts of these countries, there is no service provision of any kind. And so the challenge for us, and one that we're working quite closely with the World Bank colleagues in the forced displacement section, is how do we find an answer to these situations where there is no state provision for service delivery in these areas? What can we make, how can we approach this question of self-reliance in context where government is not reaching and where budgets very often not allocated and where people are suffering not only within the refugee community but within the local community that hosts them too. I have the next slide. These are just some statistics and explaining a little bit why we are targeting agriculture increasingly to assist with lifting people out of food insecurity and trying to achieve this objective of self-reliance. The budgets that we command globally are relatively modest, and we try as much as possible to target the poorest of the poor in these circumstances. Not always easy. And within the global country program that we have, the largest interventions you will see in places where the refugee populations, particularly in Africa, are the largest. So in Chad, in the DRC, in Ethiopia, Uganda, Mali, Cameroon, etc. Many of these countries, you'll be aware, have their own food insecurity problems. And so it's important increasingly that we link with development partners. We have no pretensions ourselves to being able to resolve the bigger crises that occur, but it's of vital and critical significance to be able to leverage our knowledge of these field situations with the expertise that we find in organizations like the World Bank. Rather than walk you through further slides, I think I will just terminate here and be very happy to answer any questions in the course of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent introduction to what's a very difficult set of issues. I'm going to quickly introduce your panel here. Mr. Joe Saba is an insider-outsider, JD from Yale, international MA from Harvard, international lawyer. Then he became one of you, country director, now advises EU, World Bank. In fact, he's about to get on a plane to Beirut on an assignment, so we have to finish this assignment on time. We're very pleased to have you moderating, sir. We've got over here, let's see, Mr. Harold Alderman. I've had the pleasure of knowing him, although he probably wouldn't remember me, but meeting up, especially in Ethiopia over the years. Harold has done a lot of work for you. He's been an influential author. He's gone out to IFPRI, but is back with you in many different times. He's got a new book coming out on food safety nets that's going to be very interesting. Nutrition, he's got nutrition and economics. And again, PhD Harvard. Too many qualifications, let's be honest. Colin Kelly, I'm sorry about the seating arrangement, but you're towering over everyone else, which is nice. Associate Research Scientist at Columbia University, IRI, and Senior Fellow at the Center for Climate and Security in Washington. His research focuses on climate variability and change and the climate, water, food nexus, food security nexus. So thanks to have you. Rifkin, let me get this up here. A little hard to, I love this, the CEO of Digital Green. So this is Microsoft's first nonprofit spinoff, which is kind of incredible. So he's agreed to give me some free software, which is nice, so I'm glad about that. But he received a master's in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from MIT. My goodness. And my favorite, he's a licensed private pilot. That's all you need to know. But lots of different interesting backgrounds there. But I think you'll hear about your work as well. All right, who else do we have here? See, I cannot forget Edson. Thank you. Edson, he's the coordinator for Enable Youth at the African Development Bank. What's interesting about this, and we've talked about it before, it's about empowering youth as agripreneurs. And we've had this theme come up again and again. How do we get a grasp on this? And it's mentoring them and training them throughout the value chain. He's done a lot of different things here. Please look up the bios. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to turn to Mr. Joe right now. I'm going to give you the microphone. When you get up, we're going to have quick interventions. The microphone's over here, wouldn't you know it? And when Joe's going to start us off with some ideas, some thoughts. We're going to have some comments from the panelists, then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So please welcome our panelists, everybody. You can just start talking, Joe. Joe, just start talking.
It's working?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and this one will pass back and forth.
All right, good.
Well.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for having me here today. It is, in some ways, like coming home. Also want to thank Ewan for his excellent view of the landscape and what faces UNHCR, as well as everyone in this room. I am not someone coming from an agricultural background. I have a different background. But working with the bank as an institution, I had for a long time the issues of helping the teams allocate resources from one sector to another and dealing in, frankly, some of the most difficult places. And since I left, I've done a lot of work in South Sudan, Yemen, and Somalia, all of which are dire places. One point that stands out for me as I look back, and I think it is very relevant right now, is I wish, and I would hope looking forward to 2050, that frankly a lot more resources and thinking and effort would go into agriculture. because I think the issues that come up and what we see in the field and what I know you see in the field touch on these very basic needs and these basic service delivery. However, it's not so easy. What I'd like us to think about as we hear the next presentations is this. In these kinds of fora, we get a lot of very interesting information, a lot of great facts, sometimes some inspiration. It's great stuff on Sunday. But I want you to think as we move through the next presentations, it's Monday morning now. You're back at your desk. You've absorbed everything in this forum and quite a bit of other things, and you've listened. Now, what is it you're going to do on Monday morning? I'd like to leave another thought with you. A lot of what you do is based on an architecture that was devised right about the time I was born. And like a lot of things that came out at the time I was born, it needs some renovation and rehabilitation and a lot of maintenance. That architecture, which guides the UN agencies, the bank, a lot of NGOs that attach themselves, as well as bilateral programs, may not be directly relevant to the issues that we are facing and that was presented to you a little while ago in fragile conflict and violent places. And in particular, we watched the situation in South Vietnam. It's very, very unclear whether or not that architecture remains totally suitable and relevant to what we're doing. So what makes a difference? Context. And think about this, and please ask our panel, do you believe you have the tools in your toolbox to address these very difficult issues? So now I'd like to get on. We'll go to Edson first. We're going to have short presentations. We'd like then for you to please ask a lot of questions, perhaps relating to the nexus of this humanitarian development divide in this great challenge. So we'll get on with the program, and Edson, you're on.
Thank you very much for that. Before I begin, yesterday, the speaker who was giving the keynote on the futures asked here, is there any competition for the World Bank? I almost stuck up my hand, but I looked around. I was alone, so here's a competition today. But jokes aside, I've been asked to come here to talk a bit about what the African Development Bank is doing in terms of youth employment, and specifically on agriculture and agribusiness and rural youth in fragile and conflict areas. Towards the middle of last year, the bank approved a new strategy on jobs for youth in Africa. This is a broad strategy. It's focusing on 3 key areas or sectors where there's great possibility for youth inclusion, and that's in agriculture, industrialization, and ICT. Today I'm going to talk more about in agriculture, on youth in agribusiness, which is the program that I'm coordinating. Now, it's the most advanced flagship of within the Jobs for Youth in Africa. I won't go back over a lot of the statistics on youth demographics in Africa. Today morning, I think Julie Howard really did a good analysis of the youth in Africa. Yesterday, I think Ethel presented the pyramid, population pyramid, which showed very clearly that Africa has the biggest youth population and it's growing compared to other parts of the world. So we need to do something about that, but specifically on youth and employment. Right now we have about 420 million youth in Africa who are considered within the age group of 15 to 35. These are all in the workforce. Unfortunately, about a third of those, or about 140 million or so, are unemployed, underemployed, or inactive. About 2/3 are in wage employment. However, some of them are in vulnerable employment. Now, this is a demographic that has great potential for Africa. If you can capture their energy and the imagination and the creativity of youth, it can really be a great boost for African economies. However, on the other hand, as many people presented, that if we do not harness them well, they're also a great threat to get into a lot of social disruption, not only on the continent in Africa, but globally. I think we've seen that. So what we've done, our vision within Enable Youth is really how can we engage these youth within the agriculture sector where we feel that they can actually, there's a lot of potential, for agriculture and for youth in this area. This is a program that has sort of three key elements. And I'm saying that the analysis, I believe Julie really presented, the analysis. This program actually is addressing many of those issues. The first component is on the enabling environment for youth employment within in agribusiness. And this is where, as ADB, we work with the government to actually put in place policies that encourage decent jobs for youth in the agribusiness sector in rural areas. Within this component as well is the aspect of changing the mindset, not only of youth, but of the public in general, about agriculture being a viable business opportunity. Right now, most of the youth don't want to get into agriculture because they think, this is dirty, it doesn't pay, it's not something that is respected. But so this is an area where we've been working a lot. That's the first key component. The second component that we have is on agribusiness incubation. This is where we are working on training and providing skills to the youth. These are skills along the whole agricultural value chain. Now, many times when we talk about agriculture, people think only of production, the hard work, the back-breaking work. But here we talk, when you want to get youth in this, is you can participate at any part of the agricultural value chain. This, I think, gives more interest to youth. Way, upstream in terms of inputs, in terms of production, in terms of mechanization. Earlier on, we talked about Hello Tractor was here. So those kinds of activities which are within the agricultural value chain. How can youth come in? All the way to production, to agro-processing, up to marketing. We also provide, within this component, business development training, which is very key for this sector. And thirdly, on agribusiness incubation. Here we're working with one of the presenters who presented earlier, Alex, in the African Agribusiness Incubation Network. Once these youth have gone this training, through this training, they get attachments to businesses within the sector. And the third component, which is also very important, is on access to financing. And here is where we come in with instruments where we can de-risk the loans to banks, commercial lending banks. It's through a commercial activity in terms of providing access or to finance to these youth who have gone through this training. So very briefly, this is the component that we're working on. And just to let you know that I think many African countries have taken this on board. They bought into ideas. We have more than 30 countries who have provided expressions of interest to the bank to invest in this area. Last December, the bank approved, when I say the bank, it's the ADB. I know within this crowd it's different, but anyway, 4 projects were approved last December. Some of them in fragile states, in DRC, Nigeria, Sudan, and in Zambia. And this year, we're working on a number of projects, and we hope to appraise about between 5 and 10 projects in Enable Youth. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Good. And Joe, I think we can have dueling bank competition after. Would that be useful? Yes.
Yes. Let's move on to something maybe entirely different.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. Imagine for a moment that you're an agricultural extension officer tasked with training farmers on an improved agricultural practice or technology. Farms are remote, terrains are difficult to navigate. Farmers and the population of these communities is large and diverse. Now imagine you're an agricultural extension officer in Afghanistan. Security, mobility, it's a huge and daunting challenge. At Digital Green, we partner with existing government and non-governmental actors that are involved in providing extension services through running farmer field schools, demonstration plots, and that have large armies of these frontline extension officers whose job is to do this hard work of trying to train and motivate farmers in the first place to adopt practices. And where even in a country like Ethiopia, with over 50,000 extension agents, less than 2% of them report actually relying upon them and applying the practices that they teach. And so what we do at Digital Green is we train these very same extension agents, often in very close partnership with World Bank programs like the National Horticulture Livestock Program in Afghanistan or the Agriculture Growth Program in Ethiopia, to produce short videos that are by the community for the community. Short 8 to 10 minute videos that really feature these local individuals, these local farmers as the main stars of these videos that people are able to relate with. Now, as we took this model, which began in India and in Ethiopia, to Afghanistan, people were cautious about whether this would be possible. Could you produce videos in a place that has such security and crisis types of situations? And can you involve women especially? Because we currently, across our work that we do around the world, work with over 1.5 million farmers, 80% of whom are women. But how could you do the same thing in Afghanistan? And what we learned is that by actually involving the women themselves throughout the whole process of producing the videos, having them appear in the videos, showing the videos to fellow women groups, you can engage women. And in fact, the adoption rates of these practices by women on their own fields was higher than by their male counterparts. The approach that we have is to start by producing these videos that are by farmers and for farmers, and to partner with these local extension organizations that already have these large field forces. We currently work with over 20,000 extension agents across the work that we do in South Asia and Africa. But really, it's the communities themselves who are involved in producing and showing these videos. The fact that the first two questions that people ask about these videos is not about the economics of these practices, but what's the name of the person in the video and which village is he or she from? It's really that sort of American Idol dynamic that gets farmers to see agriculture not as a vocation of last resort and something that everyone is anyway already trying to migrate out of in droves, but something that can be a source of prosperity for themselves and for their families. These videos then are shown primarily offline, because obviously in these places, whether in Afghanistan or India or Ethiopia, have limited infrastructure, electricity, internet connectivity. And the way these videos are shown, it typically is offline, using battery-operated mobile projectors into the existing social organizations that these communities already have, like women's self-help groups or farmer clubs or what have you. And these small groups that already meet with their extension agents now have this video to be able to boost the capacity of the extension worker. And what we found in a place like Afghanistan is that they have several thousand extension agents in the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation and Livestock, and as supported through the National Horticulture and Livestock Program. But it's so difficult to commute from a place like Kabul to pretty much anywhere, and to build the capacity of these extension agents in a consistent way, with quality, in a way that's going to be able to relate with the farmers ultimately, that you hope to be able to adopt these practices for themselves and see sort of the changes in productivity and nutrition that these practices could confer, is almost impossible to do through face-to-face means. And the way that we do that, though, is through these videos themselves. So before even these videos are shown to the communities, the first user of the videos is the extension agents. And for these massive extension systems that have several thousand extension agents, that can be a huge impact in and of itself at a systems level. What we found is that this approach can boost the adoption rates of these extension systems from what typically is between 10 to 15% of farmers who will come to a demonstration plot and apply the practices that they see or hear about for themselves on their farms, up to about 40 to 50%. And this represents a cost savings of taking what generally costs about 35 to 40 US dollars to get one farmer to adopt one new practice, down to around $3.5 to $4. Basically a 10x improvement in efficiency. And this system is not just supported by the content that is locally produced and distributed, it's also supported by the gathering of data and feedback from the communities themselves about what practices did farmers get exposed to, what did they like or what did they not like, what questions did they have, what practices did they adopt or not adopt over the course of time. And we gather this intelligence for every one of the 1.5 million farmers, because every one of them is different in terms of what types of things that they're interested in. And in a place like Afghanistan, also, this is a huge win, because data quality assurance in a place that is so hard to get to, gathering data through interactive voice response systems and mobile can be a way to get this intelligence and to make your extension systems more targeted. In conclusion, what we found at Digital Green is is that by partnering with agricultural extension programs that are already out on the ground, the communities themselves, that's how we can close the digital divide. The digital divide isn't going to be closed by technology alone. It's by partnering with organizations and individuals who have the intent and capability of investing in organizations and financing and other types of infrastructure, that technology can then boost the effectiveness and the participation of the communities that they work with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for suggesting to us perhaps one of those tools that we need in our toolbox to make agricultural realized in these difficult places. Move on to Colin.
Thank you. And thank you to the World Bank for allowing me to participate in this discussion. As mentioned before, I'm a climate scientist. Agriculture is not my background, but I'm particularly interested in doing research in arid and semi-arid regions that are inherently vulnerable due to water and food-related stress. I think it's important, and I've come to realize through some of the research that I've done over the last few years, that it's not a good idea to consider regional or national climate change or variability or climate shocks in isolation, but rather to consider it in its proper context. And what I mean by that is that it's very important to consider whatever is happening in that region, environmental stress, whether it's related to climate or not, related to the other factors which are very important for overall vulnerability. And again, vulnerability can stem from a combination of a number of factors, whether it is poor governance or access to water or agricultural choices, economic factors, etc. All of these come together in a very dependent way to produce what we can think of as overall vulnerability or resilience in a particular place. And I think it's important to look at case studies such as the Syria case to be able to say something about the overall vulnerability of a place before we can say anything meaningful about how climate change has impacted it. I and my colleagues several years ago wrote a paper about the Fertile Crescent, about climate change in the Fertile Crescent, and specifically about the implications for the multi-year drought that occurred in Syria directly prior to its uprising. And what we concluded was that the climate change signal was distinct in this region, and what it was acting to do was to create more frequent and more severe multi-year droughts. There was a severe multi-year drought in the 80s, in the 90s, and again in the later 2000s, which was the most severe multi-year drought in the observed record, that occurred right before the uprising. So we wanted to answer some questions about how can we begin to quantify the impact of climate change or even of the drought to some of the fallout that occurred. And we're all well familiar with what has happened in Syria, so I won't go into the details there. But I think this is important because the concept that climate factors can impact a society's success or ultimate demise is not a modern concept. This has been long believed and has been attributed to the demise of a number of civilizations throughout our time. But what's much more difficult is to begin to quantify that role. And that's a lot of what I'm trying to work on now. I think it's important to keep in mind that this is very complex and multivariate, but that, as I mentioned before, you have to consider all the factors together, that it doesn't make sense to consider any one of them in isolation. And so that's mostly what I've been working on lately. After I looked at Syria, I also looked at Yemen. It's another example of how the relationship between these different factors is different in every case. Even the relationship between access to water and agricultural choices is different in every place. And so it's not appropriate to look at 100 countries and to do a linear regression and say that that applies to all countries. Rather, it doesn't apply to any specific country. So we have to be careful about how we examine these things. I would be remiss if I did not say that because this is a very interdisciplinary topic, it's very difficult to come by research funding to explore these kinds of issues, which is unfortunate, but we're pursuing some avenues that are more private funded rather than government funded to try and answer some of these important questions, but also to really identify the gaps in our understanding with the relationship to these variables. I want to emphasize also, too, that these kinds of things, whether it is increasing environmental stress or climate change, does not imply some kind of climate determinism as it relates to conflict. There are a number of countries that have experienced significant environmental stress that have gone more the way of diplomacy or cooperation. Obviously, that's the ultimate desire, rather than the way of conflict. And so one of the big questions is to be able to say, well, why does this occur in some places but not in other places? What are the reasons, and what are the relationship between these variables that brings one outcome rather than another? So I'll leave it at that and take any questions that you have later. Thank you.
Colin, thank you very much. And again, another suggestion, some tools for our toolbox. Frankly, I wish we had a lot more of that back in 2007, 2008, when we were looking at water for irrigation projects and reform of the diesel fuel subsidies, which impacted the water pumps in Syria. But we didn't have those tools, but we certainly could have used a lot more. Move on to Harold.
Thank you. We heard at the beginning of this session that their fragility is not just a humanitarian issue, but is an opportunity, or should be an opportunity, to enter into development. And I'd like to address both those from the standpoint of social protection programs, where they fit in, particularly nutrition-sensitive social protection, where you can use the need to support people's livelihoods in a manner that can also protect nutrition. In humanitarian crises of various types, whether it be due to fragility or due to climate vulnerability, there's a high risk of children with severe acute malnutrition. They have an elevated risk of mortality, 10 times what the normal child will have a risk of mortality. There are two overlapping innovations that are done that reduce this risk a lot. One is the development of ready-to-use therapeutic food, which is very high in lipids, and it doesn't spoil, so that it can be used, it can be transported and used in environments, and it's fed to children with severe acute malnutrition. But the more important part, going back to what one of my colleagues said about in the community, of the community, community-based therapeutic feeding saves lives much more efficiently at a much lower cost than clinic-based. Governments still like to do rehabilitation clinics where you put a number of children, perhaps with a doctor present, but the caregiver has to spend time with the children. And the child should be there for 10, 15 days. The caregiver usually leaves after 2-3 days, brings their child home without full recovery. Plus, you have the issue that you have one room with maybe a dozen children, all of whom have compromised immune systems because they're malnourished. What happens is infection goes from one to the other, and high rates of mortality. Bringing it into the community, which can be done because these therapeutic foods are relatively easy to deliver, saves lives at much lower costs. And this type of program right now, in emergency situations where you try to get livelihood to the family, child-oriented, is usually targeted towards the severe acute malnutrition. Some programs try to use these programs to prevent the moderate from becoming severe. Relatively few programs try to get the average child from becoming moderately acute malnourished. There are some NGOs, Medicine Sans Frontier is particularly active in this, which tries to say, let us get in our emergency responses. Let us get programs which can prevent children. Reformulating it using local foods, because right now many of the ready-to-use foods are imported, or the main ingredients are imported and put together locally, but still it's made imported. This is an approach which is still being explored, and to tell you the truth, the results currently are mixed, but it's something which really one has to look at. Now, getting to the development, just to take a minute, I was pleased to have a little plug for the book that I'm putting together with Ugo Gentilini and Ruslan Yermtsov at the Bank and Social Protection, where we're looking at the history of food-based safety nets. We're not trying to promote, we're not trying to advocate, we're just saying these programs are there. The reason why they're relevant to the fragility issue, During World War II, England, as well as Egypt, which is more or less under English control at the time, and British India all put in ration systems to deal with the crisis of war. In a few years after the war is over, England abolished this system. Egypt, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka still have systems, well, Sri Lanka actually has evolved, but still have systems which show the footprints of the system put in 1942. What happens is that crises put in systems for safety net, for distributions, for protecting agriculture, for protecting consumers, which tend to stay. They do evolve. And that's the second part. Crises also lead to evolution of these systems, one of the conclusions of the book. A foreign exchange crisis will lead to a reform. Indonesia, which had systems in place when they found out that they couldn't control their foreign exchange rate, changed their systems in response to that. So crises are somewhat put in systems which have maybe a little too long a tail, last too long, but crises often are also the opportunity to reform these systems that were put in for other reasons, but have evolved and changed their purposes slightly, but tend to have their path dependency needing a little shock to get out of their path dependency.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, a very good presentation in terms of what we can do and what we might do going forward in these very difficult places. What we'd like to do now is we do have some time left. Want to thank the panel very much. It's always difficult to prepare to address such a large audience and then be told you have to do that in 2 minutes. So it's very difficult. I think our panelists have a great deal of knowledge to present, and what we'd like to do now is, as we try to keep the presentation short, what we'd like to do now is come out to you, please, for some questions. We can take a number of questions. If you have one for a particular member of the panel, please indicate that. If it's a general question, one or more members of the panel will take your question.
Just to add again, please, if you've already asked a question in the last 2 days, let's have somebody else ask it. And if you could keep your questions short, the old 140 characters. I know these are complex issues. So let's try and get some people. We see one back there. Also, I want to be a bit gender biased, not biased. To make sure we have, there's one back there, sir, who is holding his hand. And who am I seeing? Madam? Sir, madam? Thank you. I can't even see across there. Yes. Oh, jeez. And one here. So we've got 3 questions right now. Please go ahead.
Yeah, please.
So, Joe, you're going to make note and then follow up. Okay, please go ahead. Could we have some volume back there, please? And yeah, you'll have to apologize. Because of these lights, when we're up here, we can't really see who people are. So just apologies for that. But I can see a beard, I think, so I think I know who you are. Whew.
Yeah, a white beard. Yeah, my name is Stefan Foreman. I'm a senior livestock specialist in the bank and having worked in many fragile countries. First, a comment regarding the first presentation. You started by saying that very often markets are limited in those countries and environment, and I think it's not totally true. And we have many of those countries, fragile countries, where we've got huge market, and where in fact we've got big players in town which have vested interest in not necessarily coming back to an organized country. And we need to deal with that if we want to address agriculture in those countries. And I'm talking about gum arabic in Sudan, livestock in Somalia, cocoa and coffee in PNG, or those kind of countries. There's big export market that are not limited and are really huge opportunities. I just wanted also to ask a question about. I mean, we've been hearing a lot about how to do things differently. My question is really, I mean, currently that's really the priority. Is it to find ways to do things differently or just to do something? And my response, honestly, is yes, we should start focusing on only doing something and recognizing, accepting the huge cost associated in coming into agriculture and rural areas in those fragile environments, and also the huge risk associated to it, taking the risk that everything can collapse. And so my question, and for example, specifically to our friend from the bank, the African Development Bank, don't you think that more than doing things differently, we should first really acknowledge, accept those risks, accept those costs, and try to do longer term development more than only reacting to emergency with aid and humanitarian things? Thank you.
Let's take the second question over here. Can we also turn the house lights right up, please? Let's take the question there, thank you, and then we'll have the third question here, and then we'll have some responses. And if you could just tell us who you are.
Thanks. I'm Barbara Hendry, now an independent consultant, formerly with the administration of President Obama, working with USAID. So the question I have is really for our colleague from UNHCR, and it's when you look across at the current division of labor in the global architecture, what are the sort of 2 or 3 or 4 areas where you would really like to see the bank be more forward-leaning in its programming, particularly around agriculture and food security and livelihoods, to address these issues of forced displacement and refugee emergencies? Thank you.
Very good. And we have one comment here, and then we'll take the next 3. So if we could have a microphone here. Of course, we know who you are, but maybe everybody doesn't.
Julie Howard, Michigan State University. Thanks. This is for Ricken and Edson. As we in Michigan State are talking to our colleagues in Nigeria and Tanzania about our upcoming youth program, the government officials invariably say, you're only reaching 10,000, you're only reaching 5,000. So we think about scale. So Edson, I'd love to know how African Development Bank is thinking about what recommendations, what learning do you have already, or thinking about how to get learning about increasing the cost effectiveness of these youth programs so they can actually be taken up and scaled by government. And Ricken, can you talk a little bit more about the role of ICT and digital technologies in reducing costs and increasing scale?
All right, maybe since we have a few questions for Edson, maybe if Edson doesn't mind, we'll start with.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is very interesting questions. I think Stefan was talking about intervening in these fragile situations and the risks involved in that, and what approaches we take. Yes, I agree with you that we need to look at more of the long-term approach. However, there's also situations for when you do have to come in with humanitarian assistance in the short term when there's an emergency. I think yesterday there was a small side meeting here about the situation in the Horn of Africa. If there's famine right now in the Horn of Africa, we do have to intervene immediately. But as you say, that, we also at the same time we do need to look at the long-term approach. How can we mitigate these actions that happen? What's happening in the Horn of Africa now? I mean, if in my view we had put in place systems in the last drought of 2011, I think it would be much easier to be able to address this situation. So I think it is important that we do need to see how we can intervene for the longer term. But just to add on to that, in these fragile situations, sometimes we tend to think that we have to have all these challenges, address all the challenges before we can intervene. But we have examples where even in fragile situations, we have had some kind of intervention short term, and we have actually seen, without having to have everything, in place, but I think designing our programs, that are more sustainable, and intervening, and you actually see a big results coming out of that. Specifically about youth, I mean, I had a couple of slides here to show as an examples. For example, in DRC, which we consider as a fragile situation, there's an agripreneur, down in Bukavu who has been working in high-quality cassava flour. And this young man, he came to the bank, we met him, and he's been doing this, and he started off, with some of his colleagues. They were producing, I think, 900 kilograms, per week. Now they're producing 14 tons and marketing, that high-quality flour. They were making $600 a week. Now they're making $10,000 a week. This is a youth who did a bit of training similar to Enable Youth through working with IITA initially, and we're working with IITA. But now, they're up and running. They're making $10,000 a week. So even in fragile situations, I think there's opportunities if we actually intervene and take advantage of those. The second question from Julie about scaling up. Yes, these programs are fairly expensive, and we talk about even 10,000 is also quite ambitious, even with those figures. That's what we're targeting at each of these countries. But I think here is the importance of bringing in private sector early on. In the commercial banks, it starts off as a public sector project where the government takes an investment, in the youth, through the training, through the incubation. But I think what we're learning is that up from the beginning, when we're starting, with the training, is to bring in the commercial banks. How can we de-risk them so that once these youth, take off, they're the ones who are going to create employment even for other youth. We might target, 5,000 youth, but if each of them is going to actually employ another 3 or 5 youth or even more, like the young man in Bukavu, I think that makes it a bit more sustainable. So it's a new program, so we don't have, so far, say, okay, yes, this is what happened, and this is what we can do. But as we go forward, we have to put in elements of sustainability, of including the private sector right up front, in the incubation sector, so that it moves from being a public sector, investment into a private sector.
If you just stand up, they'll mic you up. I think it will. They'll get you going, yeah.
Okay. In answer to the question on the division of labor, I think there are...
I'll take that. Thank you. Let me switch.
So to the question about the division of labor, I think there are 3 things that I could think of. Firstly, preparedness. When humanitarian agencies respond to impending displacement, we tend to think in fairly simplistic terms of the immediate essential requirements of food, water, blankets, shelter, that kind of thing. Very rarely do we actually anticipate the shock on service delivery, on local markets and supplies, on consumption of natural resources, when very often there can be quite severe competition for land, for water, for firewood, etc. And I do believe that bringing a development organization like the bank much earlier into the equation will be a great comparative advantage for all. We tend to think, understandably, the refugees are much less so on the local populations and the challenge that a displacement can represent for them. So that would be the first thing. And allied to that is the bank's comparative advantage in its counterparts within government. Because most states tend to think of refugees, as I was saying, as a security and political issue and not as a developmental one, our counterparts are very often lodged within a security-minded ministry like Interior or Security. With the bank having partnerships and institutional arrangements with the Ministry of Finance, Supplying and Economy, it enables, I think, a different set of voices and reflections to enter into the discussion. So I think that's the second thing I would say. And thirdly, again, allied to the policy discussion, are the institutional arrangements. Again, what often happens is ministries of interior set up their own internal departments to look after refugees, effectively setting up a parallel system within the government rather than calling upon reasonably well equipped institutions within the government landscape to respond to that. And this is particularly true at local level. So I think institutional arrangements that the bank has with its partners can be brought into play much more productively than setting up parallel systems, either delivered by humanitarian agencies or indeed set up by governments themselves. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and to Julie's question about using technology to help with scale, I think just as you heard in the previous section with Hello Tractor or even like our work, you know, technology is really good at optimizing the utilization of sometimes underutilized assets, right? And so in the case of our work in partnering with extension systems, largely of the type that are of the public sector type, there are these large field forces that are out there and that are charged with trying to train farmers. And what we're trying to do with technology is to say, can we enable those people to be able to make their roles that much more impactful and that much more efficient by using videos that make their programs more consistent and of greater quality, use data and feedback to make their interventions more targeted to the communities that they serve. And that's how we've been managed to scale to 1.5 million farmers when we're just a team of 100 people. And we use the very same technology that we use at the farmer level to self-replicate our model. Like we have videos about video making, videos about video sharing, to essentially be able to self-replicate this model across the systems that we work with. And in fact, I think ultimately that's the deeper impact that we're going after. At some level, it's obvious that you take like a one-to-one demonstration that's physically taking place on a farmer's field, you capture it on video, and you take it to more people, clearly like an efficiency play. But the deeper impact that we're having is saying that let's build consensus and consistency of what are the messages in the first place that like the extension system wants to promote. And then what is the schedule and the system at which these messages are going to be targeted at what place and what time to which audience? And how do we get intelligence about what people care about? And what data can we use to back that up? So in fact, I think that ultimately is the longer term sort of like scalability and also ultimately impact sort of objective that we have, because you can get a lot of scale with ICT. You can do a broadcast television or radio or mobile program and get a lot of reach. But did you get impact? I think that's where like partnering ICT with existing systems that are on the ground becomes that much more critical.
Thanks. We'll take some other questions. Just one comment on that. A lot of that impact is extremely important. We had a good deal of success in a different industry, in the carpet industry in Afghanistan, by taking media and getting it out to the villages to convince people that, in fact, there's a very lucrative market for their wool, for the carpets, and for the things which they had already given up and felt they could not get a livelihood from. And so that type of media exchange is both ways. Could we get some more questions, please?
We've got about 12 minutes here. Let's get a question over here, maybe, and then one back there. And let's take one more from that corner, which I really can't see. Is there a question back there by any chance? So let's start here, and number 2 over there, and then we'll see how we go. Oh, we needed a mic. Oh, my
Thank you.
goodness.
I'm Michael Morris. I guess if I identify myself as being part of the agricultural global practice, that's a bit meaningless in this context, but I'm working in Latin America region right now. Great session, and we've heard a lot of sort of eloquent arguments made for the comparative advantage that the bank has in doing certain things that related to preparedness and then reconstruction. And of course, the history of the bank goes back to being really in the reconstruction business. But let's hear the flip side of that. I think one of the frustrations that many of us have in our operational work, we're designing operations, we kind of come into it with a long-term development perspective. We kind of think that's what the World Bank is really about. A crisis comes along and there's a huge pressure to engage in participate in emergency response. And we've heard Ewan was making the case for some of the relationships with ministries that are set up to do that. Of course, we often have financing mechanisms in place too that we can inject funds quickly into an emergency context. But what are the things maybe where the bank should actually push back and say, we're not really very good at that and we shouldn't be? Are there some things that we shouldn't be doing and that we shouldn't take on? It'd be interesting to hear that perspective.
Excellent. Now, where was the, yes, could you have a, great.
My name is Isabella Leão, and I'm in agriculture, South Asia, working primarily in Afghanistan and India. I would like to maybe hear a bit from Edson on the youth employment in agriculture. I have a PhD in youth employment in conflict and fragile affected situations, and we focus on Sierra Leone. And when you look at the root causes of conflict, and especially the reason why young people fall into violence and conflict, is unemployment. And for most of these countries, FCS, the unemployment comes in the rural areas from the lack of access to the land. So there is no way to talk about youth employment in agriculture without talking about land reform in most of these countries. And that's what I came across in my PhD in Sierra Leone, and this could be replicable to other contexts as well. And when you talk about, for example, agri-entrepreneurs, youth agri-entrepreneurs in FCS and linking to commercial banks and the private sector, this will really be touching on the tip of the iceberg when we talk about youth employment in agriculture in FCS, because the bulk of them will be in the primary production without access to land, dependent on working for free for the elderly who hold the land. So how do you see the youth employment in agriculture, but really looking at the bulk of the problem, not necessarily just those in Freetown, in Monrovia, in Bukavu, in Kinshasa, but also in the remote and rural areas?
Should we start with those two? We only have about 7 minutes left. So should we start with those two, Joe?
All right, let's start with those two. The first one was, what don't we do? I may ask Radson to give us an idea of what perhaps the African Development Bank doesn't do. In the presence of Jürgen, though, who's sitting over here, I don't think any of us want to say what we do and don't do, but I will tell you something from my own experience on that in terms of what we don't do. It's basically having the guts to sit somewhere one evening and say, we don't have the resources, capability, or information for this work. Jürgen and I, 25 years ago, sat on a balcony in a hotel in Central Asia. Jürgen had the guts to say, we can't do this, I'm out of here. Radson.
Thank you. I think you're more qualified to talk about that question about what we banks can do and can't do. I won't say much on that, but what I must say is that we don't have, I know at the ADB, many instruments to come in, especially on emergency assistance. We often get responses, requests rather, to come in and intervene. But from my knowledge, we don't have very many instruments. The way we are set up is more of the longer term, approach. But I won't get much into this. I know, for example, when there's a disaster in a particular country and we have a fund, special relief fund. It's a very small fund, 1 million, to a particular country. But it's something that actually we can put in place very quickly, within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks once we get a request. But it's very small, and we don't have that many resources, and it's more or less the only instrument that I know that we can actually respond that quickly. But I think other colleagues, in the World Bank can probably comment on that. Now, my colleague there about youth employment and the policy, especially on land. I agree with you fully. Land is critical in all of agriculture. I didn't mention it very much in the Enable Youth context because this is one of the programs. But in our wider strategy for agriculture, which we call Feed Africa, it's a new strategy. Policy on land is one of the key areas that we're working on. So it's something that we need to work on, and we've been working on for many years, but it's still very key. In terms of addressing the youth, in the rural areas, yes, it's one of the areas that we'll address. However, the program that of Enable Youth, it's one program within the wider Jobs for Youth in Africa. We do have, and the Enable Youth program focuses on graduate youth. So we try to have it focused because of one of the resources that we actually have. And there is a niche, there's a need there for youth who are graduates. So this specific program that I talked about actually focuses on graduate youth. But I do agree with you that there's a need for the youth who are out there in the countryside who don't have access to many of these commercial banks that I was talking about. Now, however, just to respond slightly to your question, we have just completed a study. The final report is not yet out, but we do have some preliminary information about entrepreneurship in the rural areas in conflict and fragile countries. And some of those areas that you actually brought about in terms of, for example, access to finance, those are very critical in the rural areas. You find that there is access to microfinance, but many times the interest rates are so high, you can't, they are quoted on a monthly basis, 10% per month. And many times, those are areas where, the small enterprise cannot actually be able to afford that. So there are recommendations in this study, which is focusing specifically on fragile situations. So that, I think, will be addressed in that other study, and also in the wider jobs for youth in Africa. But for Enable Youth, I must admit that we are focusing more on the graduate youth.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
There was somebody at the back. If
Someone
you could
has
come
some
with your
pressing
question.
questions.
Sorry, there's an
Yes, sir.
unconventional type back there.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes,
Tim. All right.
Actually, it's slightly more of a statement, but I'd also like a response. Harold, I really appreciate your presentation and the idea that not everything we do, everything that we do will have a consequence. And I think one of the most important lessons I take away from this discussion is that in a crisis situation, if you are in the military, they learn their lessons from going over and over and over what went right and what went wrong in terms of a response to a crisis. And I don't think the development industry does that. I think we plow on with the response, and then we move on to the next response, and we rarely sit down and think through what are the positive and negative consequences of our actions and how we can build a stronger, more effective response. And I think that's partly the way that the industry, the incentives that we face, but I think it's a shame, and I think it's something that we should be changing, and we need to change in light of the growing refugee crisis.
We also had just one quick comment from Jürgen here. He's jumped the queue. I have to let him, don't you think? No, please, I'm kidding. Have a quick comment, please.
I just want to use this opportunity, since we have Ewan here from UNHCR. We have a historic opportunity, I feel now, to finally overcome this horrible, unhealthy divide between the humanitarian community and the development community. You mentioned the creation of the architecture in the beginning. It was set out historically for the reasons that we all know well. But the world has moved on. We got to overcome the way we work together. We got to do this differently going forward. And I think we're making good progress on that space. So I want to encourage my team here, whatever you do, whenever you interact with UN agencies or the Red Cross or other agencies on the ground, go out of your way to find ways to collaborate, not only during the crisis and after the crisis, but before the crisis happens. We got to move this conversation from crisis response to crisis prevention. I'm absolutely convinced that half the problems that we're dealing with, not all of them, let's be clear, you cannot prevent everything. But there are many, the famines that we're dealing with, most of them could have been prevented. The UN often has the data. Fantastic monitoring systems out there, VAM, Vulnerability Assessment Mapping of WFP, we got FuseNet, we got a lot of information out there, but the institutions that have the information don't have the money necessarily to translate the actions that are needed to prevent crisis from happening. We have the money, but we don't have the information. So we usually get together when we read in the newspaper that there is major trouble. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but we're getting together too late. And we want to change this. I'm in the process just now. One reason I wasn't here this morning, because I was talking to Kristalina about precisely that. We have a crisis again in 4 countries plus 3 coming. This is an opportunity to change the way we look at this and the way we're going to do business going forward. And for that, we need to get ahead of the curve. All our current instruments have the word response in them. Think about it. We have a crisis response window. Do we have a crisis prevention window? No, we don't, right? So we need to get that conversation up front. And I want to find ways, together with UNHCR, WFP, and the other actors in the field, to sort of really get ahead of this curve and to find ways and triggers and protocols that trigger action in our institution long before we are being pushed to put additional money on the table and start jumping up and down and restructuring projects and reallocating money and doing all these things. Just like the UN needs to act before it has to go out for a huge appeal of $4.6 billion, which is what's happening right now. So I want to leave you with this thought, that one takeaway from this conversation is that we need to come much closer together, and I think the barriers to us working closer together are being broken down as we speak on both sides. There was a good summit at the leadership level, and in the field that's happening as well. And what we now need to do is create the instruments on both sides, certainly on our side, to actually be able to act when we have the opportunity before things happen. Just wanted to leave that thought in the room.
So, Joe, this is an excellent point. It's something dear to my heart as well. And I personally believe the World Bank can be an honest broker between those two. It's an incredibly important role. Joe, last word as we go out.
I think Jürgen has summed it up. We can all think of examples from our own work where a little bit of recognition of what was necessary to perhaps prevent what we saw coming could have been done. Mike's question actually was well answered before. When you feel that you cannot do something, when you see something coming in these very difficult environments, why don't you have those tools? And think about the different tools that you might need. If you don't have the tool in your tool basket, figure out why. Get a good evaluation. And also sometimes have the guts to admit to everyone that this cannot be done. But the fact that you might not be able to do something doesn't mean, in fact, it's quite the opposite. It's a big red signal, a loud siren that says, why can't we, what is keeping us from doing this? And don't let that antiquated architecture stand in your way or leave you out in some, literally, some I-beam sitting 50 feet above the street and you don't know where to go. So I hope this panel, and want to thank our panelists for their presentation. I hope it was helpful to everyone, gave you at least a few ideas about what to do on Monday morning.
Sorry, can we have a little better than polite applause? Let's give a really good hand. That was excellent.